So we are continuing on the topic of ethics that Hartman laid out, and I think most of us were together for the first round. And so if you remember from that, there were many different ways to look at what are Jewish ethics. For those of you that were with me on this past Shabbat morning, this past Shabbat was called Repro Shabbat. National Council of Jewish Women encouraged all Jewish leaders to speak about reproduction rights in the Jewish tradition. And one of the things that I emphasized very strongly when we speak about abortion, for example, in the Jewish tradition, I mean, people like to talk about the Judeo-Christian ethic, and it's not, or the Judeo-ethic tradition. And while it is true that Christianity looks to the Torah, which they call the Old Testament, to a certain respect, and while there are certain ethics that we share in common, taking care of the poor, feeding the hungry, I mean, there are certain things that we have in common. We also do not have everything in common. And one of the really big differences, particularly between Catholicism and evangelical Christianity, is our view on abortion, or when life begins, or whether a fetus is considered equal to a human life. And it is not, right? It is, in the Jewish tradition, a fetus is not a human life, and so abortion is not considered murder in our tradition. And so when we talk about Jewish ethics, there are things about Jewish ethics that are specific to being Jewish, while at the same time, of course, there are things that we have in common with other religious traditions. So I will say one of the things that's interesting, I actually think that one of the appeals and why people have signed up, you can tell me if this is true or not, but why we really have had a pretty good sign up for this is, I think, first of all, I think people are interested in Hartman, and assume if they know anything about Hartman that it's going to be a very high level type of course. But I do tend to think that people are interested in ethics. Like when we finished the first, I can't remember how many sessions that we taught, and I'm like, what do you want to do next time? People were like, well, let's stick with ethics. So I think talking about ethics is something that clearly speaks to the people and that signed up for this class. One of the things that I will say that I find quite interesting, however, is when you're teaching somebody else's curriculum, the question of why did they choose certain sources and not others? Because these aren't necessarily all of the sources that I would have chosen to speak about what they call the moral imperative. So it's interesting, we can wonder, why did they choose this, and why, and why not something else? But the question at hand today is, are there certain morals that you would be willing to die for? And are there certain morals in the Jewish tradition that one must die for? Are there certain things that, that you would have to refrain, I guess, from doing at risk to your own life? And then you can see from some of the other sources that they chose, if you looked at them, and we're going to look at them together, that that's one question. The one question is, are there certain things that you would have to, risk your life for? And are there other things that, even though you might not, are there other things? And I feel like, again, I'm not sure why they blurred these two things together, because they're two very significant different questions. I actually think the second question is one that we more often face as human beings. Probably very few of us have had to risk our lives for our morals. But the second question that they ask are, is it possible that there are things that you are not personally responsible for, and yet you're responsible, and yet you're morally responsible for? And if you looked at the Heschel text, we're going to read it together, so don't worry if you didn't. In the ideal world, the way that Hartman sets up their program, and this was true for the privilege that I had of studying at Hartman, is what ideally that you do is that you set up chavruta, which meaning a pair of people that study together. So the ideal situation, if we were meeting in person, and we probably could do this with breakout rooms, but frankly, it just feels a little too complicated for me, is I would give you these sources. You would have a study partner. You would look at these sources together, discuss them a little bit, and then we would come back together and I would do the class and the discussion on the sources. That's the traditional way that Jews study together. And as I said, it's not impossible. What's impossible to do it by Zoom is knowing on any given day who's going to actually show up. So I could randomly put you with partners, but I don't know, maybe when, maybe that'll be level 2 of my Zoom teaching in the future. So as I said, if you get a chance to look at the sources, it's good. And if you didn't, we'll do them together. So, so those are sort of the 2 kinds of questions that our sources are going to be looking at today. One, are there some morals, some ethical commandments in our tradition that you would have to die before transgressing? And are there some things that are so important that even though you might not be personally responsible for it, you are responsible as a, responsible in sort of society? So let's begin. Sorry, you know what? I'm going to put my phone on one moment and do not disturb so you won't hear it ringing in the background.
I just went looking for our phone.
Yeah, hold on. I'm going to do that right now so it stops.
Where's your phone in case they call?
We'll come in here.
Because as you can imagine, none of these calls are even in the least bit important.
You can mute us.
Why?
That's the repairman.
Okay. So let's start with, well, actually, before I share, I want to ask you, maybe you know this already, but what are the 3 laws in Judaism that if somebody told you to transgress, you would have to allow yourself to be killed before you took that action? Do people know that? Norm?
Destroy
do
the
one.
Torah?
I'm sorry, what?
The Torah? Destroy
No.
the Torah?
No. Elise?
I think it's idolatry.
So let's stop there because we'll see. We have other people a chance to answer. So yes, if somebody says to you, either worship this idol or I will kill you, you need to allow yourself to be killed. However, one might say to yourself, do we have, so we have 2 interesting examples in Jewish history. We have what happened in Spain, right, where Jews were told, convert to Catholicism or die. What did they do?
They converted.
They pretended.
They pretended to convert, right?
Right.
They pretended to convert and said secretly stayed Jewish at great risk to their lives. But we also know that during the Crusades, that there were communities in Ashkenazi Europe that actually martyred themselves and were killed before they would even pretend to convert to Judaism. And we have some really horribly painful graphic descriptions of what that time was like in Jewish history. So we actually see 2 communities, predominant communities that handled this very, very differently. But according to rabbinic law, if you are told, worship this idol or I will kill you, you should allow yourself to be killed before you worship an idol. What are the other 2? All right, Elite. Okay, Norm will give you a second chance.
Kill another person.
Right, murder, right? If somebody says to you, you kill this person or I'm going to kill you, you have to allow yourself to be killed. And that could, come up. I mean, it could come up at a time of war. It could come up at other times, but you have to allow yourself to be killed before you murder another human being. Howard, I see you have your electronic hand up.
I'm a veteran. I just wanted to point out that I think Maimonides' position with respect to Islam was that you could, at least on the surface, convert because
Oh, no,
that
great.
was considered a monotheistic religion as opposed to Christianity, which was not.
Right. So the issue when I talked about the Jews of Spain and the Jews of Ashkenaz, it was Catholicism. And for them, that was clearly idolatry because there are icons. There's the crucifix. Like this was clear. By the way, I'll give you an interesting, fun fact that's not so fun, but interesting nonetheless. In the olden days, before COVID, way back in the distant past, our federation did these rabbinic trips where the rabbis of all the various denominations of Chicago would travel somewhere together. We would usually go to some gut-wrenching, horrible place in Eastern Europe, and then they would take you to Israel, and then they'd kind of lock you in a room and ask for your pledge. And after you stood in the killing fields of Lithuania, where you saw where 90% of the population was gunned down and thrown into pits, and then Federation said, "Would you like to help, donate to help the Jewish community?" Yeah, I'll give you anything you want. So when we traveled to places where there were churches like in Prague or places of churches of interest, our Orthodox colleagues would not go in because they were considered places of idol worship. When we traveled to Morocco, they would go into mosques because mosques are not considered a place of idol worship. So now convenient for Maimonides that maybe he didn't want to start up with the people that he lived amongst too. But Islam is, there's no iconography. It's much more similar to Judaism in that way. So, okay, no idolatry and no murder. What's the third thing that you must be killed before you, okay, Elise?
Pretty sure it's incest.
It's adultery. It's not even just incest, it's adultery, right? If you say have sex with that woman, you're a man, or I will kill you, you have to be killed. So those are the three things. So now we'll look at what Maimonides has to say about this. If idolaters will say to a group of people, now, okay, so here's a different question, right? Which deals with idolatry, but the question is, again, I'm not sure why Hartman chose this particular text, though, as we like to say, to quote Rabbi Frankel, this is a very famous text to a small group of people. Can you give up one person to save the group? That's the question. Can you give up? Are you allowed to give up one person to save many people? If you remember, if we were together, if you were part of the class, we asked the question about, which is also a famous text to a small group of people, which is, what if you were in a desert and you had a flask of water and you were with another person and it was only enough to save you? Did you have to share it and both people die? And the answer was no, you didn't. Right? If you only had enough water to save yourself, you didn't have to share it with the other person. So this is a different kind of a question, but similar in that way. If idolaters will say to a group of people, yield us one of you and we will kill that one. If not, we will kill you all. Let all of them be killed rather than surrender to them one soul in Israel. The morning after Colleyville, after the hostage crisis in Texas, I was speaking to a member of the congregation and I said to him, Judaism has a blessing that you say when captives are released. And he said to me in this tone, of course we do. there's not always, you may not know that because blessedly there aren't, thank God, other than maybe in the case of war, there aren't that many times that we can point to in modern Jewish history where, maybe Israel and soldiers, but we don't have blessedly examples, a myriad of examples to point to Jews being kidnapped and held ransom and then released. But it happened. And so it happened, and because it happened fairly commonly, there was a whole hierarchy of how you redeemed captives and then the blessing that you said. And so in the Jewish community, it wasn't that uncommon, right? That there would be a situation where non-Jews could say, give us somebody, we'll kill them and spare you. These things happened fairly. It wasn't that uncommon of an occurrence. So the question is, can you, and by the way, during the Holocaust, we know that Jews were put in this position all the time, that the Nazis had the Jews set up a council of Jews who decided who gets deported, who doesn't get deported, who's on their way to Auschwitz, who's not. And so, but our tradition tells us you're not allowed, you let yourself be killed before you actually send somebody to their death. However, what if that person is guilty? What if that person has committed a capital crime? Can you turn them over to the non-Jewish authorities? Because that's really what the issue is. Maimonides calls them idolaters, but the question is really, can you turn somebody over to the non-Jewish authorities? And the answer is, and they give an example from the Bible, so we won't get into that. They may surrender that person to them, but it is not commendable to advise them to do so. So you really shouldn't turn somebody over to circle your wagons. You really shouldn't, but you may. If that person be not guilty of a capital crime, they almost submit rather than surrender one soul in Israel. So if it's somebody's guilty of a capital crime, you can turn them over, though it's not nice, but you can. But if they're just wanted for, robbery or something like that, then you cannot turn them over. So let's just stop there if anybody wants to comment on this or ask any questions. Sharon?
So as I'm thinking about it, I totally agree. We should not sacrifice one Jewish life, but the alternative is that we're sacrificing a lot of them. So how does that work?
Right. Well, that's why it's a moral question, right? Can you sacrifice one person to save a group of people? And our Torah tells us, or our tradition tells us, no, you can't. You can't just choose some random innocent person and turn them over to save the group. All right, I see 945. You have 0206. You have your hand up. I don't know who you are. If you want to turn on your screen, or would be great. But I see you have your hand up. So what would you like to say? Okay, then Barbara.
They're muted anyway.
That rule has a practical effect. It allows people to have trust in their community members, in their own community, that they won't be given up randomly.
Right. Ina?
Excuse me, I had to unmute. This is not in regards to what you're talking about, but I'm trying to follow on the email that was sent to us. And these portions that you're putting up on the screen are not the PDF.
Yes, they are. I know.
Yes, they
Yes,
are.
they are. Yes, they
Okay,
are.
well, then I'm not looking at it.
Okay, so
correctly.
we are on unit. Let me
Skip the
tell you
first-
what unit we are
skip
on.
the
So
first
maybe
one.
that will be helpful. It's class 1, the moral imperative approach.
They weren't identified that way on the print, the thing to
Maybe
print,
it
so
was. All right,
easy
I'm gonna
enough.
have to get to the bottom of that because I didn't send them
Okay, so
out.
maybe I'm not
What
going.
about trying class unit 3.1?
Yeah, that's the identifier, because
Okay,
otherwise
try
it
unit
gave
3.1.
duplicate for classes, right?
Okay. so
And
let's
then
do
she skipped the first one.
Oh,
Yeah, the
okay.
first selection.
Okay,
I
so you're
started
on the
with source
second one?
All right, I'm
Yeah.
sorry. I might have started in the wrong place, so I
Yeah.
apologize. Don't worry then. We'll go back to whatever the other one was.
Okay, I'm sorry.
How
Just want-
maybe it was me. I started in the, I
I
sorry.
apologize for interrupting.
Howard.
Oh, no, don't worry about it.
Two things. It doesn't seem to say that one needs to have been convicted. So I don't know what committed a capital crime is, but also back when I was a yeshiva boy, if I remember correctly, violating the Sabbath was a capital crime.
It's not. You can violate the Sabbath to save a life.
No, that's not what I meant.
No, well, okay.
I meant,
In the Torah, that's what they just told you, Howard, to keep you in line. In the Torah, people were killed for violating Shabbat, but that for some reason did not become the norm of rabbinic Judaism. So there are examples in the Torah. Somebody collects manna on Shabbat after being told not to, and they're killed. But that is not the way rabbinic Judaism comes down on that. All right, so let's look at the Heschel source, which we won't call really a modern source, but wait, hold on, I'm sorry.
That's source 3.
She's playing around with it now.
Page 29.
Source 3.
I lost her. It's
Okay.
Let her again.
So, Abraham Joshua Heschel was, hopefully you've all seen pictures of him and his white beard linked arm in arm with Martin Luther King. He was a European-born rabbi who came to the United States, who was basically affiliated with the conservative movement. I don't know if you would ask him if he would have considered himself a conservative Jew, but he taught at the Jewish Theological Seminary for many, many, many years. He was a philosopher, and he really was a moral example because he stood up in the middle of the civil rights movement at a time, as a very public figure, at a time where a lot of the Jewish community hadn't really embraced that. He was very outspoken about the Vietnam War, again, at a time where the Jewish community was a little bit more split on that and on taking a more public role. Of course, our legacy at Am Yisrael is, of course, our beloved founding Rabbi William Frankel, who was in the exact same mold as somebody who I would say, would have stood up and felt very much like that this was part of the prophetic tradition of our tradition. The more deeply immersed I become in the thinking of the prophets, the more powerfully it became clear to me what the lives of the prophets sought to convey. That morally speaking, there is no limit of the concern one must feel for the suffering of human beings. It also became clear to me that in regards to cruelties committed in the name of free society, few are guilty, but all are responsible. Which I think we could have a lot to say about. Few are guilty, but all are responsible. I did not feel guilty as an individual American for the bloodshed in Vietnam, but I felt deeply responsible. Thou shalt not stand idly by the blood of thy neighbor. This is not a recommendation, but an imperative, a supreme commandment. And so I decided to change my mode of living and to become active in the cause of peace in Vietnam. Although Jewish tradition enjoins our people to obey scrupulously the decrees issued by the government of the land, whenever a decree is unambiguously immoral, one never has the duty to disobey it. So this is interesting in two levels, right? Our tradition has a teaching, Dina de Malchuta Dina. The law of the land is the law. So Jews are bound then to obey civil law, which is interesting in and of itself. I'll give that, that's an interesting thing because we have our own sets of laws, we have our own sets of courts. And sometimes we don't think, there's probably many examples, you know, I mean, the law of Russia and the laws of Poland and the laws of Morocco were not always very favorable, or how they discriminated against Jews. But you weren't allowed to, like, say, you know, I can cheat somebody, you know, I can steal from somebody because after all, they're not Jewish. Like, that was not the way that that Jewish law wanted Jews to live. And so you were basically had to follow the laws of the land. But it was really only in a democracy that you could then ask the moral question, what if the law is immoral? What is my responsibility then if the law is immoral? And the other part I find that's interesting about Heschel is the question of him saying, I'm not responsible for the Vietnam War, right? I didn't make the decisions. I didn't send troops over there. But what is my responsibility? And I'll tell you two ways that I see this play out in the Jewish community in really real ways today. One of them is about the question of, I would say there are many, but these are two that I think that we need to think about, which is one, what is our responsibility when we deal with systemic racism, particularly I would say around the question of something like reparations. You know, I've heard many Jews say, like, my ancestors weren't even here. We didn't even live here during slavery. So why, you know, why am I responsible? We didn't enslave people. And so, you know, that's one way to look at it, right? That's one way to look at it. I'm not personally responsible. My family wasn't personally responsible. But do I have some sort of societal responsibility to the good of, is there some moral imperative built in that makes me responsible in some way? The other one, you know, complicated, but Israel. Martha, you were one of many people who sent me I think it was a podcast by a British podcaster who was speaking out about the silence around anti-Semitism in England. So 98%, 97% of what he said, I thought was super powerful about the silence of our allies. You know, Dan and I have been talking, we've been waiting for days to see when the Tribune was going to report these anti-Semitic incidents that took place in West Rogers Park on Shabbat. And it took the Tribune days. It's this big, maybe you can find it. You know, the silence still, you know, even after Colleyville, some silence from our allies. But what I didn't like about this podcast, which I've explained to everybody that sent it to me, is he starts out by saying, why are Jews that live in London or Baltimore or anywhere in the world responsible for what the Israeli government does? We don't vote there and we don't pay taxes. So on one level, that's true. We have no say in what the Israeli government does. We don't pay taxes. We don't serve in the army. And so we can say we're not responsible for what Israel does. I'm not sure that's the route we want to take. I'm sure that it's not the route we want to take. For those of us that, you know, support Israel, belong in AIPAC, send tzedakah dollars there, support the legitimacy of the state of Israel. I think in Heschel's words, we may not literally be responsible, but we are. If we are supporters of Israel, then in some ways, now, good luck with getting to, you know, change the course of the Israeli government. Good luck in feeling that, you know, that we're going to really be able to influence what the Israeli government does. I'm very mad at Naftali Bennett today, who gave an interview last week saying he's, you know, has no intention of implementing the Kotel plan. So, you know, good luck. But I don't think that we want to go the route as a Jewish community.
Feel for the wall.
You know, I don't think we want to go that route and say, well, it has nothing, Israel has nothing, you know, we have no say. We don't, it's not us. It's those bad Jews over there. Unless you're an anti-Zionist, in which case, then I think you could say, I have no responsibility. I don't even think, you know, I have no connection to the land of Israel or to the government of Israel. So these are ways that I think that Heschel's point about a moral imperative, and the question of what do you consider yourself morally responsible for, even if you aren't actually guilty or actually really not responsible because you didn't have a say in the decision to begin with. So what do you think about this or any other things that you may feel of other examples that speak to you? Marcia?
What I want to know is how do we influence the elections in Israel? I mean, seriously,
Well,
if it's very frustrating, it drives me nuts, and further expansion and all of the stuff in the West Bank is absolutely. So if we have, what do we do? Withhold our dollars?
Yeah, I don't even know that I mean, yes, and Donna?
I just was going to speak up. This is the one thing I do support with If Not Now, because they are a group of kids in the US who are calling out the American community about being implicitly supporting the occupation when they feel it is immoral. And they get themselves in all kinds of trouble. And I don't agree with everything they do, but I do agree with the moral issue that they raise.
It's hard. All right, I could talk about this forever, but I'm trying to let you talk. Howard.
No, I don't want to talk about Israel in particular, but I think the word responsible has two different kinds of meanings. One in responsible could mean guilty for, and the other word responsible is something that I need to respond to and try to affect. And I think those are two different, meanings of the same word. So you can be responsible for the United States actions in Vietnam, or at least in trying to stop them without being guilty of doing them. And I think the same applies to Israel as well.
Martha?
I'm not quite on the same page as everybody else, because I think when you are saying that we have the right or the responsibility to interfere or to influence Israel, we're talking about, they're the ones who are on the front lines. So let's use the thing about soldiers. It's very nice that I, in the comfort of my living room or dining room, can sit here and rail about Israel doing this or that. But I have no skin in the game. And I think that's what a lot of people forget. Do we have?
I'm just only going to say yes, but because my politics, I'm a member of AIPAC, I support Israel.
Right.
But Israelis have opinions about other governments, what China should do with the Uyghurs. Human beings do have opinions and would like to see policy, our United States government policy about lots of places in the world. So it's true. I mean, we don't really have skin in the game in lots of places, but it doesn't mean that we wouldn't want our government to conduct a foreign policy in theory that would want to influence that government to do something that we think, would be morally a better choice. And Israelis feel that way too about other governments. So, Elise.
I think to second what Howard said, I would use the word accountability versus responsibility. Where he used the word guilty, but I actually think it's being accountable versus being responsible. And I think the idea of responsible as being a response, I think responsibility is an obligation to speak up, but not necessarily an obligation to be punished for, right, those acts that are morally reprehensible.
I don't know if this really plays out in the same way, but I'm sort of tickling my mind about even our response, let's say to the unvaccinated. Should they be allowed to take over every hospital bed so that my friend who came here to get a double mastectomy from Montana arrived and was told that her choice was either to go home and come back 6 weeks from now, or to do it outpatient because there weren't enough beds? Like, at what point, like, there are lots of questions about what, Elise, it looks like you went on, Elise.
Yeah, I mean, I think there, again, you can, and in my opinion, should speak up and say, everyone should get vaccinated. Look at all the people that are hurting, that it potentially hurts because you're not contributing, right? I think that that's a fair response in terms of responsibility. But in terms of accountability, do I think that we can punish people for not being vaccinated?
I'm listening, but I have to, as I said about the plumber, I'll be right. Speak amongst yourselves. I got to make sure it's not the plumber.
Okay, as one of those old people who feels that the unvaccinated are contributing to a sea of potential infection that could kill me, I think I can punish them.
Well,
by,
I don't.
wait, let me finish.
Okay.
I can punish them by at least making sure, if they are likely to be carriers, which they are, that they not be in spaces that I have to occupy.
I would say, I think you can limit, right, what people can or can't do as a matter of privilege, right? Because they're unvaccinated. For instance, like, I work at the pool, you have to show your vax card to get into the pool. We don't let you in unless you show your vax card. And I think that that is fine, but I also don't think that that's a punishment. We're not fining people. We're not throwing people in jail. We're not stoning them. We're not, we're not punishing people for that, but they are making a choice that, as a matter of public health, we limit their rights, right? I don't think anybody would disagree that quarantines for polio were appropriate, right? I think you can make an analogy there, and I do, but I also think that we, the vaccinated, should not be forcing the unvaccinated to do it. We can put pressure on them. We can try to influence them. And that I see as part of responsibility.
I'm going to cut this off because I want to look at one more source. Sorry. Yes, that was the plumber. So thank you for letting me take that call, because that will make my life a little bit easier today. So I want to look at one more source. And again, this is a very famous source to a small group of people. And it's a question really about, we'll see at the end, is there, if you are somebody that is so driven by certain moral imperatives, can it make you a person that actually can't even exist in the world? Can you take it too far? So Rabbi Judah, Rabbi Yossi, and Rabbi Shimon were sitting. So this means they were learning together, right? These are very famous, great Talmudic rabbis. And Judah, a son of proselytes, was sitting near them. So this is Judah, who is a convert. Unclear at this moment if he's a convert into Judaism or away from Judaism, right? But he's sitting, listening to this Talmudic discussion between these three great rabbis. So Rabbi Judah starts the discussion by saying, not Judah the proselyte, the rabbi, how fine are the works of the Roman people? They've made streets, they've built bridges, they've erected baths. I mean, some of you, if you've been to Israel, you've seen the viaducts, the Roman, like if you've been in the Cardo in the old city, and you've seen the old Roman road and where the shops were and all of the excavations. I mean, where Rome went, Rome built. And they built great things. I mean, roads are a great things to have, streets, bridges, bathhouses. You know, they built all of this amazing infrastructure in the land of Israel and other places that people could benefit from. So he starts by saying, these are great, you know, they made the trains run on time. These are great things that the Romans brought to the land of Israel. Rabbi Yossi didn't say anything. Like no comment. But while you're waxing poetic about the Romans, I'm not going to say anything. But Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai answered and said, all that they made for themselves, all that they made for themselves. Okay, they built these things, but they didn't build them for us. They built them for themselves. They built marketplaces to set harlots in them. So that, you know, that's, what do they want to buy? It's not for the goods, or, you know, so they have prostitutes. That's why they have marketplaces, baths to rejuvenate themselves, bridges to levy tolls. So why did they say bridges? Like we, you know, we managed without them. They built bridges and now we have to pay a toll to be able to cross. Now, Judah, the son of proselytes, went and related their talk, which reached the government. So the assumption is probably that he was a Jewish person who was given the name Judah, who had left Judaism, right? So he's an informer or a tattletale or whatever he is, but he reported this rabbinic conversation to the Romans. And so they decreed, Judah, Rabbi Judah, who exalted us, he shall be exalted. Like he said good things about us, you know, as a rabbi, we're gonna, you know, give him a public, you know, praise. Yossi, who was silent, shall be exiled to Tzipori. Tzipori is in the Galilee. So he's exiled. You know, you don't say good things about, you can't, there's no neutral here. So you can't stay, you gotta, you know, we're making you move. Shimon, who censored, let him be executed. So he risked his life, you know, by saying bad things about the Romans. Now, this isn't exactly, I don't know that it was a moral imperative to say what you were thinking, right? Like that's, I say this to a member of my family quite a bit. Just because you're thinking it doesn't mean you have to say it. So, you know, Shimon obviously felt it was an immoral imperative to just tell the truth, say it like it is. And now he's made himself liable to be executed by the Romans. So what did he do? He and his son went and hid themselves in the study hall, and his wife brought him bread and a mug of water, and they dined. But when the decree became more severe, he said to his son, women are of unstable temperament, sorry. She may be tortured and exposed us. Right? Like she's hiding us, but if the Romans come and torture her, she's not going to be able to withstand the torture and she's going to give us up. So they went and hid in a cave. And then a miracle occurred, and a carob tree and a water well were created for them. They would strip their garments and sit up to their neck in sand. The whole day they studied. And when it was time, so their clothes would never wear out. They were modest, right? They covered themselves in the sand. They were very modest. They, you know, kept their clothes folded up in the cave. But when it was time to pray, they got dressed and they covered themselves and they prayed. Then they put off their garments again so they would not wear out. And thus they dwelled 12 years in a cave. So they had water miraculously appeared, a carob tree. So what did they do for 12 years, day in, day out, buried themselves in sand, studied all day, unburied themselves, dressed themselves, prayed 3 times a day. And that's what they did for 12 years. Then Elijah came, Elijah the prophet, and stood at the entrance of the cave and exclaimed, who will inform the son of Yochai that the emperor is dead and his decree annulled? So they outlived the emperor dies, therefore the decree dies with him. So they emerged. So now they're done, 12 years. What have they learned? Seeing a man plowing and sowing, they exclaimed, they forsake life eternal and engage in life temporal. Whatever they cast their eyes upon was immediately burnt up. So these zealots who have spent 12 years only in study and prayer alone, like monks, come out, and what do they see? They see the real world just going on. People involved with commerce, making money, and they're really judgy. Shimon Bar Yochai is known as a very judgy rabbi, really judgy. Look at these people just going on. And their power is so vast that all they have to do is look at another person with this judgment, and the person just burns up. And then God comes down and says, have you emerged to destroy my world? Return to your cave. Now, you might think that God would like them, right? These are people, these are devout people. He stood up for the truth against the Romans. He paid the price of 12 years. You know, all they did was study and pray, study and pray. You might think that this was what God would think would be the ideal human person. They come out, they can't believe people just, involved in commerce and don't understand that life should be a life devoted to Torah. And so they burn up these people, and God says, what the heck are you doing? You came out of a cave to behave like this, to destroy my world. So what is God's world? God's world is a world that, yes, Torah study exists, but God's world is a world where people go, have commerce and go on and have relations with their family and have children. And that's the world that God created. And God doesn't want to see these zealous rabbis destroying the world. So they returned and they dwelled there 12 more months, saying the punishment of the wicked is, even the wicked, this is about the afterlife, so let's not get lost in that. But even that punishment is 12 months. A heavenly voice then came forth and said, go forth from your cave. Thus they issued, wherever Rabbi Elazar wounded, Rabbi Shimon healed. Said he to him, you, my son, you and I are sufficient for the world. On the eve of Shabbat, before sunset, they saw an old man holding 2 bundles of myrtle running at twilight. What are these for? They asked him. They are in honor of Shabbat. And he replied, but one should suffice you. One is for remember and one is for observe. And Rabbi Shimon said to his son, see how precious the commandments are to Israel, and their minds were tranquilized. So there's a lot to explain there. So let's just stop for a minute. First, he sees the world and he's very judgy because all they care about is, the world cares about is commerce. So it's a very superficial judgment that he makes in the moment. God punishes him. They go back to the cave for 12 months. And the next time they come out, they see a man running around, rushing to get ready for Shabbat. And he's got these 2 different bundles. And they say, one bundle would be enough. Why do you need these 2 bundles for Shabbat? So it says in the Torah, in the first set of commandments, we're supposed to Zachor et Yom HaShabbat, we're supposed to remember Shabbat. And in the second one, in Deuteronomy, it says Shamor et HaShabbat. So there's a lot to say about that, but all we'll say is we're told we're supposed to observe and guard Shabbat. And now they understand that that while you have people that are running around and during the week worrying about a livelihood, you also see on the eve of Shabbat Jews that are running around getting ready for Shabbat and care about Shabbat and care about the commandments. And then they understand, right? They understand something about the world, which is there has to be a balance, right? That zealotry is not the way to conduct yourself, right? That there has to be a balance between human needs, the needs of the world, and preparing your religious needs and the needs of Torah. And that it can't be all, God doesn't want it to be all one or the other. So this is a text really about, and there are other places, this isn't the only example where we see Shimon Bar Yochai have very harsh judgments And usually his interpretation of the law is rejected because he's so harsh in his judgments. So, the tradition likes to present sort of a moderate. That's why there are only 3 things that you have to be killed rather than, kill. That there are times that are reasonable, that you have a flask of water and you only have enough for you, and you don't have to risk your life to, you don't have to die to save somebody else. And there are times when you have to risk your life and you can't turn over an innocent person to the authorities. But there are times where that person is guilty to save more human life, then you have to do that. There are times for Torah study and there are times for plowing. And so while there is a way, whether you're accountable or responsible or whatever, the word that Heschel, we would use to describe Heschel, Judaism gives this, limits the way that you would risk your life for a moral imperative. Now, remember, we're not talking about a moral, like I feel that it's a moral imperative that I keep kosher. Like, of course, there are ways that you look at the tradition, and the understanding is you're supposed to keep the laws of the tradition. But the question is above and beyond that, what are your sort of obligations in society? And Judaism comes down with this last text on a very balanced view between the needs of the real world and the needs of sort of the spiritual world. And those two are supposed to be, in our tradition, are supposed to be balanced, which is why I can't remember who in my family used to like to point this out when I was a little girl, long before I ever imagined myself becoming a rabbi. That rabbis get married and that rabbis have children and that, I don't know, rabbis do yoga, whatever it is, right? That rabbis live in the real world in a way that, let's say, if you were a priest, it would be a very different way of living in the world. Or if you were the ideal Buddhist, a very different way of living in the world. So anyways, I will just end it with that. If people want to have things that they'd like to say. Sharon, you put your hand up.
I just want to talk about sort of an interesting twist on that story. I want to talk about the rabbi who said nothing, but yet was punished because I'm a docent at the Holocaust Museum, and we talk a lot about how there were no innocent bystanders, and silence was one of the worst crimes. And yes, okay, maybe he shouldn't have spoken up in favor of the Romans because the Romans persecuted the Jews, but the Romans recognized that the silence favored the perpetrator. And that goes back to all we talked about with responsibility. What is our responsibility? And we could be silent. We could be silent about the anti-vaxxers. We could be silent about what Israel is doing. But is our silence complacency or encouraging acts that we believe are wrong? So I just thought it was very interesting that back then the Romans understood that silence favors the perpetrator.
There is actually a phrase in the Talmud about silence is assent, consent is assent, not assent. Like if you don't speak up, it's as if you've agreed. So it's actually, that's in Jewish law as well. So, which is also interesting in a whole other way about the whole idea that they're teaching young people, and particularly young women, about consent. Just being silent I don't know how it really, really works in the real world, but in the ideal world that they're teaching our young women and our young men is that just because she's silent, you can't assume she wants to have sex with you. She has to say, yes, I do, which is, a different way that many of us had, thought about how one would speak out at certain times. Marcia.
Yeah, I mean, this goes against the whole longer tradition of women being silent.
Right.
So it's got a long way to go, or it's coming from a long way to go.
Right. Aina.
We have to get gas pretty soon.
You want to drink, Danny?
Sure. You just have to be careful. Give me a second.
All right.
You know what? I'm sorry. I just unmuted. I'm sorry.
Okay.
My question is, I don't know if it's a moral
Give me a minute.
perception or to define, not to say you don't have skin in the game in reference to Israel. Well, in my respect, it's my moral perception that it's my Jewish community. Although I don't have somebody in actual Israel, but it is part of the Jewish community I identify with. And that to me is my moral perception. Is that wrong or is that
No,
correct?
I mean, I happen to agree with this. I feel like since we're doing Hartman curriculum, I will quote the late Rabbi David Hartman, who is the founder of the Hartman Institute, who said, Israel is too important to be left up to the Israelis. But I will say, so, okay, we don't vote, we don't serve in the army. We realize that when you're Israeli, your kids are on the front line. Like, I think that Martha's point is really well taken. Like, let's not be, naive about that. So what I encourage people to do is to look for organizations in Israel that support the kind of Israel that you want to see and get involved in those organizations. And there are many of them. If you are, super upset about the occupation, well, guess what? There are a lot of Israelis that are super upset about the occupation too. Affiliate with them, donate your dollars to them. I feel very passionately about the growth of the conservative movement in Israel. I think that they bring a very important, moderate, religious voice that isn't heard enough in Israel. So in my very limited tzedakah dollars and in my volunteer time, that's where I focus my time and attention. Like, there are ways to try to help build the Israel that you want to see. It's not fast, it's slow going. It feels a lot of times like, a million steps backwards, but there are ways to be, we don't have to sit back. I think Martha's gone already. I'm an AIPAC supporter. And the reason that I'm an AIPAC supporter is because I feel very strongly that I want our Congress to be pro-Israel. I feel very strongly about that. So I'm involved in AIPAC. You may not feel that way. You may feel like, no, I want our Congress people to deal with Israel in a different way. Well, guess what? There's an organization for that. You could join a different organization that has a different point of view, that wants to see our Congress act in a different way. So there are ways to be involved, to try to help shape Israel. As I said, I don't know, my whole life I've been doing this, not sure exactly, where we are on many of the issues that I care about, but in the bigger picture, to me, it's not if they're doing this or they're doing that or they're whatever. It's the Jewishness in me that feels that Israel is the Jewish community. Right. As a docent in the museum, and I am touring kids around, and I get to the part where the ships arrive in Israel, and I say, who knows where Israel is? And I have a group of 20 kids in front of me, and not one person can raise their hand and say, I know where Israel is. Now, that to me is a lesson that should have been taught before they even come. And that to me is, I'm at the museum for a prideful reason, because I believe in that institution, but also because it's the Jewish community. So even if I don't have a person in Israel, doesn't mean that I don't have skin in the game. I have the skin in the game.
Okay, on skin in the game, even if it's unjustified, and even if it's wrong, and even as a community, we should accept it. It is not correct, though, that we have no skin in the game, because Israel's actions, once again, whether justified or not, have a direct impact on us in America, because it fuels anti-Semitism and is used by various bad people. So my feeling is that their actions, because they affect us, maybe indirectly, but definitely in fact do, they have an ethical responsibility towards us as well.
look, and they will say, and then we have to go because time is up. Israel is the country of its citizens, both Jew and non-Jew, who live there, who vote, who need to make responsible decisions about their government. But Israel is also the Jewish dream of 2,000 years come to fulfillment for all of the Jewish people. And Israel sees itself, Jewish Israel sees itself as, they don't always act this way politically, but that we are part of the renaissance of Israel. So, the average Israeli may not really care what an American Jew thinks, but on this, there's a minister of diaspora affairs. Think about what that means, that there's a minister of diaspora affairs in the government. Like, I don't know that ministry exists in any other government, right? That there's a sense that, we have a responsibility, a connection, a relationship for Jews that are not citizens wherever they live. And this isn't just about if, God forbid, they're persecuted and we need to move them here. So I'm about to be on a call next week with the Minister of the Diaspora, who's going to try to, assure us that the Kotel agreement isn't dead, which of course, whatever, but I'll let you know how that goes. All right, listen, everybody, I don't know if we're going to get a snowstorm. Donna, probably don't have to worry about that in North Carolina. So though it's balmy out, it's in the 40s today. So I will say one thing, I was laughing because I do think this is kind of funny. I'm sorry that Boston got hit so hard by the snow and the East Coast and all of that, but when they were reporting the following day, there are going to be, bitter cold in Boston. It's going to be 22. I'm like, oh, really? Like, we'd like to see it warm up to 22, but okay, Boston, buck up. All right, everybody, have a good week.